And I want to welcome everyone here in the Frankopan Hall in Jesus College and everyone who's joining us on Zoom. And there'll be space later for questions, which can come from here in the room, but they can also come from people on the webinar. And if you haven't thought of it already, now might be a good time to turn off your phones. My name's Sarah Colvin, and I'm the Schröder Professor of German at Cambridge, and I'm a Fellow of Jesus College. And I'm very aware that you're here to listen to Sharon Dodua Otoo speak, and not to me, but I need to say a few words before we start, just to welcome you to the lecture and to welcome Sharon as our Schröder Writer in Residence. The annual Cambridge Schröder Lecture is a celebration of the endowment of the Schröder Professorship of German, which first happened in 1909, and then it was re-endowed in 2012. And since 2019, the lecture's also been an opportunity to remember a very remarkable person, Mr. Bruno Schröder, who died in February 2019. But until his death, Bruno Schröder attended almost every single Schröder lecture, partly, I think, out of kindness and out of courtesy, but also because he had a kind of irrepressible intellectual curiosity. And I have a memory of a conversation I once had with Bruno Schröder, where he told me he enjoyed life very much. He'd have been, I think, well into his 80s by then. He enjoyed life very much because he learned something new every day. And I asked him how that happened, and he said it was because he listened to people. This year, I'd like to offer a particularly warm welcome to Dr. Tim Schröder and Mrs. Ellen Schröder, and to Theodora Meyer, born Theodora von Schröder. It's a huge pleasure to have you here. Thank you for coming. And those of you who know me well, come on in. Those of you who know me well will know how much it means to me to welcome Sharon Dodua Otoo as our inaugural Schröder Writer in Residence and as our speaker for the 2022 Schröder Lecture. The Schröder Endowment supports German studies at Cambridge in numerous ways. And this year, for the first time, thanks to the endowment, we're able to have a Schröder Writer in Residence. And it's extremely special that it's Sharon Dodua Otoo. When I went on sabbatical leave in 2019, I had a research plan, which I didn't follow at all, because at the beginning of my leave, I took the opportunity to catch up on some reading. And I began with Sharon Dodua Otoo's short story, Herr Grüttrup sitzt down, Herr Grüttrup setzt sich hin, which had won the Ingeborg-Bachmann Prize in 2016. And by the way, for those of you who aren't familiar with the German-speaking world, the Ingeborg-Bachmann Prize is a huge thing in the German-speaking world. It's a very major literary prize. So I thought, well, I'd better read this since I've now got some time. And my breath was taken and my mind was blown, really. And I spent my leave then obsessively reading the writing of Sharon Dodua Otoo and the new German literature that she's right at the center of. And I'd never felt so excited to be a professor of German. This is really writing that does something quite breathtaking. So I'm very grateful and honored that Sharon agreed to come to Cambridge as our first ever Schröder Writer in Residence. And she's also been elected a visiting fellow of Jesus College. Sharon Dodua Otoo, I'm sure most of you know all of this already, but she's an influential essayist and a public intellectual, and she's a cultural and political activist. I think it's fair to say that she's currently best known as a remarkable literary writer who writes literary fiction in English and in German. You might already know her novellas in German, like Synchronicity. I don't want to give any spoilers, but if you haven't read it already, it's going to make you think differently about how you imagine the world. It's very remarkable. And there's another one who I think whose title ought to be enough to make you want to read it. It's called The Things I Am Thinking While Smiling Politely. Doesn't that make you want to read it? On Friday in the Web Library in Jesus College, there'll be another opportunity to hear Sharon, to hear her read from and discuss her recent novel, Ada's Realm, it's going to be called in English. It was on the bestseller list in Germany as Ada's Raum last year. And if you want to come to that event too, you can find it on Eventbrite. And there's a sign up to come in person or to join us on Zoom. And at the end of this week, there's going to be an international conference in Cambridge to discuss and consider Sharon's work. An important context for this lecture, which Sharon's going to say more about, is that she's been invited to conceptualize and curate a 3-day Black Literature Festival for this year's Ruhr Festival in Western Germany. It's called, for German speakers among you, Resonanzen, It's the Ruhrfestspiele, and it runs from the 19th to the 21st of May. But I won't say any more about that because I think you're going to. So before handing over to Sharon, I'm just going to say some very brief thank yous. Thank you, first of all, to Jesus College for letting us use this great space for the lecture, and to all of the college staff who've helped make the practical and IT arrangements for the lecture possible. Thank you very much to the Schröder scholars, Jasleen Garcia, Saul Packer, and Benson Sands, who helped on the doors and may have shown some of you the way in. And thank you to Miriam Schwartz, who's going to relay the questions after the lecture from the people who are watching online. And a very big thanks to the Schröder Research Associate, Stephanie Galasso, who's watching from California online, and Tara Talwell-Windsor, who's here in the room, who've both done an enormous amount to help make this happen. And now over to Sharon.
Ooh, what an introduction. It's been a long time since I've given a talk in English, actually. I wonder if I can still do it. Now I can see my writing, but I can't see you, unfortunately. Thank you very much for that warm introduction. And thank you everyone for coming along this evening. And where's the camera? Is that the camera? Okay, I can't see the camera anyway. Yeah, thank you for that too. Thank you for being online, wherever you are. My talk this evening is called In Search of Resonance on Black German Literature and Literary Criticism. I'm deeply honored to be standing here and to have the opportunity to share my thoughts on German literature and literary criticism with you all. This is going to be personal. When I was first invited to give this lecture, I thought about what I could possibly talk about. Actually, first I kind of freaked out. And then I thought, I knew I wanted to talk about my passion for writing and for empowerment and how I combine the two. And I also thought it would make sense for me to talk about how A, being the eldest daughter of Ghanaian immigrants, as well as B, being a girl who grew up in Ilford, Essex with the name Sharon, if you know, you know, led me to become an award-winning writer of German fiction. And I wanted to share my reflections on my experience of literary criticism in Germany. But then a few things happened, including the Russian invasion of Ukraine at the end of last month, escalating a war that actually began in 2014. And so I stand here speaking from a fragile and broken place. I decided for this evening not to try to make this look easy, well-organized and the like, because after the outbreak of a global pandemic, which despite vaccines, despite restrictions, lockdowns, masks, is not going to disappear anytime soon, after the public lynching of George Floyd, after the racist and anti-Semitic murders in Halle and Hanau in Germany, with the escalating climate crisis, with Brexit and its aftermath, with the looming threat of nuclear war hanging over us all, I think it wouldn't be emotionally or intellectually honest for me to try to do this any other way. What I bring this evening are two things. The first is a question disguised as a title, and the second is a collection of puzzle pieces in lieu of an answer. The first puzzle piece is on a loop, by the way, this presentation. And yes, I am aware that I'm presenting a part of an answer to you without having even stated the question yet. But in my defense, I'm not exactly known for being a writer who employs linear narrative forms. You knew what you were getting, or rather Sarah did, or should have, but I digress. I'm showing a presentation which I made at the end of 2020 for an event in Frankfurt, where I've been asked to provide a creative answer to the question, who are the racists? And my answer was, no one, there are no racists, nothing to see here. Racism is forbidden, has been since 1945 when those very bad Nazis were shown the door, and all the Black Lives Matter hashtags prove it. But then I said, and yet the question arises, how would this presentation differ from a presentation of a Germany in which, for entirely racist reasons, Black people were forbidden to live as authors, to work in publishing houses, or to participate on literary juries. And this brings me to the question contained in the title of this lecture: where can I, as an author, find resonance for my fiction writing, given that this is the context within which I write? So contained in that question are two assumptions. Allow me to take a few minutes to unpack them before I share my various attempts at an answer. Assumption number one is, we all understand what I mean by resonance. Also in 2020, I had the honor of presenting the Klagenfurter Rede zur Literatur, the Klagenfurt speech on literature, on the opening evening of the 44th Festival of German Language Literature, more commonly known as the competition for the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize. Sarah mentioned that in my introduction. This competition, by the way, is quite a unique format. An international jury consisting of 7 members from Switzerland, Austria, and Germany invite a total of 14 fiction writers to present their previously unpublished texts on live TV over the course of 3 days. And following each reading, a usually critical, often heated jury discussion takes place. And at the end of the whole thing, the winning text is voted for, also live on TV. It's like X Factor, but for writers. I participated myself in 2016, and in 2020, I was invited back to give the opening speech. In my speech, Dürfen schwarze Blumen malen, and I haven't really figured out a good translation for that title. I spoke broadly about negotiating fiction or writing fiction as a Black person in Germany. And at one point I said, erst durch die Rezeption wird das, was ich schreibe, zur Literatur. Vorher ist es bestenfalls ein Monolog, und ich möchte mit meinem Schreiben auf gesellschaftliche Missstände hinweisen. Dafür brauche ich Verbündete. Erst durch die Rezeption wird mein Wunsch zum Programm. Which means, only when my writing is read and discussed does it become literature. Before that, it is at best a monologue. And I want to highlight social grievances with my writing, and for that I need allies. Only when my writing is read and discussed does my wish become an agenda. So when I use the word resonance, I have this aim in mind. My hope is that my writing will strike a chord, that it will harmonize, it will feel familiar and or relevant to people who choose to engage with it. Assumption number two, that it's possible to tell simply by looking whether or not I will find resonance in any given place, which is of course not true. First of all, even in this presentation, there may be more Black people pictured here than I realize, or that we realize. For example, those Black people who do pass or could pass as white. Secondly, just as with many Black German studies students I know, German language fiction resonated deeply with me. Or to be more specific, white Christian, straight, cisgender German language fiction resonated deeply with me, because that's pretty much all I read as a German studies student. But why did the literature resonate with me? I can give 2 examples of the many works that I particularly loved. One of my favorite characters in German language literature completely is Clara Zachanassian, the main character in the play Der Besuch der alten Dame by Friedrich Dürrenmatt. In English, it's called The Visit. It's going to go beyond the scope of my talk to go into detail about why I love Clara so much. Suffice to say, she's out for revenge, both against an unscrupulous ex-lover and an entire village whom humiliated and abandoned her. She was forced to leave her community as a penniless and pregnant young woman, and decades later she returns to the village and she gets revenge in the most spectacular way. Perhaps I wanted to be like Clara. A second text I really loved as a student was the short story Dr. Mürker's Gesammeltes Schweigen by Heinrich Böll. In English, it's translated as Mürker's Collected Silences. The story is a depiction of the intellectual continuity between Nazi ideology and culture in the Federal Republic during the 1950s. I really admire the way Böll combines his biting social criticism of post-war Germany with a very precise satirical humor. And you heard it here first. Next month, this story will be republished in German by a small publisher called Edition Zweifel. and will include a contribution by me. So it's like Böll Otoo. It's really impressive. Look for www.zweifel.jetzt. So I really loved German language literature, and yet something was missing. To put my finger on what exactly that was requires me to bring out two more puzzle pieces. These are the Africanist and double consciousness. In her seminal work, Playing in the Dark, published in 1992, the Nobel Prize-winning novelist, Toni Morrison, writes about what she calls whiteness and the literary imagination. And very briefly summarized, she describes how white US American authors write fiction which creates and reinforces whiteness as the norm. In these literary worlds, Black figures are often inserted to represent the other, to provide the opposite pole of whatever it is that white characters are representing. These Black figures are not in and of themselves real individuals with a character arc and an inner life. And this she calls Africanist. I'd like to quote from the text because it's quite stunning. Toni Morrison asks, what does the inclusion of Africans or African Americans do to and for the work of a white author? As a reader, my assumption had always been that nothing happens. Africans and their descendants were not in any sense that matters there. And when they were there, they were decorative, displays of the agile writer's technical expertise. I assumed that since the author was not Black, the appearance of Africanist characters or narrative or idiom in a work could never be about anything other than the normal, unracialized, illusory white world that provided the fictional backdrop. Certainly, no American text of the sort I am discussing was ever written for Black people, no more than Uncle Tom's Cabin was written for Uncle Tom to read or be persuaded by. As a writer reading, I came to realize the obvious. The subject of the dream is the dreamer. The fabrication of an Africanist persona is reflexive, an extraordinary meditation on the self, a powerful exploration of the fears and desires that reside in the writerly conscious. It is an astonishing revelation of longing, of terror, of perplexity, of shame, of magnanimity. It requires hard work not to see this. The Africanist exists in German literature also. We think of the Black presence in children's books like Struwwelpeter by Heinrich Hoffmann, 1845, or in stories like Die Probe by Herbert Malescher, 1954, or novels like Die Weiße Maasai by Corinne Hoffmann, that was written in 1998, or plays like Unschuld by Dialoa, that was published in 2003, that's how you say it. In all these works, the superiority of the white subject is emphasized by a deficient, pitiful, or even terrifying Black object. Okay, my page isn't turning. One moment. Double consciousness is a term coined by the historian, author, and civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois, and it describes the internal conflict experienced by African Americans living in a predominantly white society. Double consciousness is something that is arguably familiar to many Afro-diasporans. They experience the world through their own marginalized perspective, but also have a very firm grip on the dominant or white perspective. And I'd like to quote a passage from his work, The Souls of Black Folk, which was published in 1903. Du Bois writes, "It is a particular sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two reconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. One of the best-known Black German writers and poets, Maya Yim, describes exactly this sensation in her work. In her poem, Grenzenlos und Unverschämt, Borderless and Brazen, she writes, for example, ich werde trotzdem afrikanisch sein, auch wenn ihr mich gerne deutsch haben wollt. Und ich werde trotzdem deutsch sein, auch wenn euch meine Schwärze nicht passt. Which translates to, I will still be African, even if you want me to be German. And I will still be German, even if my Blackness doesn't fit in. So with these two puzzle pieces still in our hand, the Africanist and double consciousness, let's go back to the subject of resonance and my consumption of German fiction. During my studies, one of the major reasons the literary greats were presented to me as being great was because they wrote about universal themes which affect all of mankind. I deliberately chose the word mankind. These works of white people, or more specifically white men, are indeed understood themselves to be universal. This works if white people are understood to be universal. And yes, it is possible to read this literature in this way. That is at least what I did. And sure, it requires an even greater amount of willing suspension of disbelief, but marginalized people do this all the time when consuming dominant media. Or who amongst us hasn't watched and wistfully celebrated the love story between Hugh Grant and Julia Roberts in the film Notting Hill, while simultaneously silencing that tiny voice which asked how the filmmakers managed to create an entire romantic comedy in that part of London and only have one Black person in the film, literally one. He was the guy who came out and told Hugh Grant that he couldn't go in when she was doing the film. He's like, you have to go home. That was it. That's all he said, actually. In the home of Europe's biggest Caribbean street festival, but I digress again. It is possible to ignore this little voice, but the cognitive dissonance becomes too loud when an Africanist figure is introduced. And when this happens, Black people receive explicit confirmation that our lives and experiences are not deemed to be universal in the literary imagination. I'd like to put down those two puzzle pieces and pick up a different one. It's a corner piece from my childhood, and it might contradict everything I just said, but we should always remember that there are no easy solutions to complex problems, and anyone who says otherwise is lying. I used to enjoy writing poems and short stories and songs, and the lyrics of one song from my teenage years that I still remember, it goes like this. It's been so hard to find my way with my eyes shut tight. I had to open them. Now I can't sleep at night. And if I sang a song that no one understood, who would I turn to then? Where would I go? I need to have someone, I need to have a place, I need to have some time to call my own. I need to rest my feet. I've walked for 14 years. Can someone tell me, please, where is my base? The strategy I chose to somehow cope with these feelings of isolation was to double down. I left England about 3 years later and went to Germany, a country where I really was a foreigner, where I really did not speak the language so well, where I really did come from somewhere else, where the marginalization I experienced was made more bearable by the fact that the place really was not my home. So, dear Sarah, it's a huge irony that I stand here before everyone today. I left England looking to revel in this sensation of feeling lost and misunderstood, only to have my writing discovered by English-speaking academics who now teach and research my work, and in some cases, understand it even better than I do myself. I'm going to change the presentation now. Sorry, I'd like to start it again. We are now looking at an entirely different puzzle piece. These are about some of the many lessons I've learned living in part of a Black community in Germany, specifically from two members of ADEFRA, a Black queer feminist organization. Come back to the mic. From Katja Kinder, one of the founding members of ADEFRA, I learned to love and appreciate the word resonance. She uses it to help think about how we as Black people exist in any given room or context. For example, when invited to participate in discussions about discrimination or diversity or intercultural competence, brackets, we do have more subjects of expertise than that, but I digress, close brackets. Are we the only Black person on the panel? And what does this isolation do to our position, to our content? All too often, Black expertise is reduced to the individual and the particular. And how is it for our Black children in the education system? How are their realities and lives reflected in their learning environments and school books? And if they aren't, what are the consequences of this for the self-esteem and mental well-being of our children? From Maisha Auma, another key member of ADEFRA, I learned the practice of working with images of Black people in PowerPoint presentations. She calls it Sehgewohnheiten stören oder unterbrechen, in English, disrupting visual habits. And incidentally, I haven't told Maisha this yet, but as a writer, I've applied this same principle to my art, Lesegewohnheiten stören oder unterbrechen, in English, disrupting reading habits. Maisha also has a very strong gift game, but that's another story. I have often been asked why I write fiction in German at all. And in the early days of writing my first full-length novel, I cried myself to sleep wondering the exact same thing. I kind of fell into German fiction writing by accident. A little earlier, I mentioned the competition for the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize. I ended up winning the competition that year for a short story that Sarah spoke about. I'd written this short story for an entirely different context. However, after winning the prize, I joined a renowned literary agency. I signed a book contract with a renowned publisher in Germany, and I had more requests for reading and speaking engagements than I could manage. I was going to say shake a stick at, because I haven't said that in many, many years. Anyway, I also really don't find it easy to write in German. I am fluent, but I will never be perfect. And no matter how long I live in the country, I will never acquire the deep-seated knowledge which comes with being socialized in the place. This affects not only the vocabulary and the imagery I use, but the issues I write about and the perspectives with which I approach them. But I stuck at it. One reason is because there are periodically reoccurring debates about language and writing and whether it's possible for it to not reproduce racist, anti-Semitic or sexist language. And if yes, to what extent this represents a limitation of artistic freedom. And I find it a frustrating kind of Groundhog Day discussion because my answer is, yes, of course it is possible, and no, it does not limit artistic freedom. And can we please move on to how we can make it possible? Because admittedly, it's not an easy thing to do. And can we please recognize that artistic freedom in its truest form does not exist? While writing this book, I had a chance to explore these ideas further. It was challenging and I learned a lot. I also made it an explicit aim to write more Black main characters into the German literary imagination. But what is so important about that? I've often heard that there are more important problems. For example, when we're protesting about the use of the N-word or campaigning for street names to be changed. The assumption behind the more important problems argument seems to be that it's impossible for activists to effectively negotiate the balance between resisting multiple forms of racial injustice in our work. But we can. Indeed, I think the more important problems argument ultimately weakens political movements because it attempts to enforce a homogeneity of priorities within marginalized communities that just does not exist. For example, Black feminists like Audrey Lord, Bell Hooks, and Kimberly Crenshaw have taught us that it's counterproductive and exclusionary for Black organizations, which are typically dominated by Black men, and feminist organizations, which are typically dominated by white women, to ask Black women to choose which one of their oppressions matters most. The heterogeneity of Black communities makes necessary broad alliances of various groups which identify with the ultimate aim of dismantling all racial hierarchies. Finally, the more important problems argument also downplays the continuities that exist between the various expressions of racial discrimination, leading from innocently meant comments about a person's physical appearance all the way through to police violence and murder. These continuities exist because racism is not merely a single isolated incident that occurs when someone uses an inappropriate word or beats up a so-called foreigner. Racism exists as a deeply embedded structure of inequality, one that is created and stabilized every day in smaller and bigger interactions or actions. Who is conceived of belonging to us and of being worthy of attention, of care, and of protection is shaped in no small part by the literary imagination. Please allow me to return to the war in Ukraine. I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture that I was feeling fragile and broken. By now, reports of African students being thrown out of trains and buses or being forced to wait for days at the Ukraine-Poland border while those deemed to be white were waved through are well known. But before evidence of this injustice was available in the form of eyewitness statements and media reports, my thoughts immediately sprang to the refugees of other various war-torn countries drowning at the EU borders or freezing to death in the camps at Moria. The EU response to the humanitarian crisis in the Ukraine has for the most part been nothing short of fantastic. And I personally know of people who have been volunteering for days and weeks at community organizations and at the main train station in Berlin, and of people who have donated their time and cash, but donated their time as interpreters or welcomed refugees into their homes. And I'm truly grateful and full of admiration for their sacrifice. And at the beginning of March, EU ministers even agreed to activate Council Directive 2001/55/EC. This sets minimum standards for providing temporary protection, and I quote, to displaced persons from non-EU countries and those unable to return to their country of origin. This possibility has existed since 2015. The journalist and author Mohammed Amjahid describes my feelings exactly when he posted on Instagram, als ich nach Beginn der putinischen Aggression von der Richtlinie, that one 2001/55 EC, erfahren habe, fiel ich in ein noch tieferes Loch. In English, when I learned about the directive after Putin's aggression began, I fell into an even deeper hole. I've seen people react angrily to the suggestion that racism has a role to play in the very clear double standards being applied here. I read an argument which went along the lines of, yes, perhaps something did go wrong in the past, but Ukraine is the priority now. Yes, it is difficult to focus on more than one tragedy or injustice at a time, but we must. As the social activist, writer, and poet Audrey Lord once said, we do not lead single issue lives. In fact, this morning I went back and reread her 1982 essay, Learning from the 1960s, it's called, where this quote comes from. The text is an address delivered during the celebration of the Malcolm X weekend at Harvard University. It's a brilliant text. She begins by positioning herself as an inheritor of Malcolm, working in his tradition with, and I quote, the ghost of his voice through my mouth. And later she says, we who are Black are at an extraordinary point of choice within our lives. To refuse to participate in the shaping of our future is to give up. Do not be misled into passivity, either by false security, they don't mean me, or by despair, there's nothing we can do. Each of us must find our work and do it. Militancy no longer means guns at high noon, if it ever did. It means actively working for change, sometimes in the absence of any surety that change is coming. It means doing the unromantic and tedious work necessary to forge meaningful coalitions. And it means recognizing which coalitions are possible and which coalitions are not. It means knowing that coalition, like unity, means the coming together of whole, self-actualized human beings focused on believing, not fragmented automatons marching to a prescribed step. It means fighting despair. So for the reasons I've outlined in my talk, I chose to write. That's my work. Ada's Realm, or Ada's Realm, is my first full-length novel. In it, I explore how the past still affects the present day. Specifically, I look at the legacies of colonialism, imperialism, and Nazi genocide in present-day Germany. I won't talk so much about Ada's Realm this evening, as I'll be giving a reading from it on Friday. So I'd like to pick up the puzzle piece on resonance again. It was spring 2021 when Ada's Realm appeared. 2 other novels, debuts from non-white writers, appeared at the same time. Ministerium der Träume, Ministry of Dreams, by Hengame Yakubifara, and Identity by Mitu Sanya. For many months, the 3 novels, those 2 and Ada's Realm, would often be mentioned together, almost as if there'd been a kind of revolution in German literary publishing. In 2021, the second novel of Schröder Lecture, Drei Kameradinnen, 3 Comrades, also appeared. Schröder's novel and my novel were not compared so often, or maybe I just didn't notice. However, when I read her novel, I was really excited about the way Schröder structured her plot. Her main character, Cassie, who narrates the entire novel from a first person perspective, comments on the structure of the novel herself. She says, I'd like to read it in German because that's the language that Schröder used, but I'll read the translation straight after. Es ist ja auch nicht so, als hätte die Welt uns eine Reihenfolge geliefert, die Sinn ergeben würde. Warum sollte ich mich dann an eine halten? Reihenfolgen sind was für Deutschlehrer, damit sie unseren Geschichten zügeln können. Was für Geschichten sollen bitte schön entstehen, wenn man sich immerzu an Einleitung, Hauptteil, Schluss halten muss? Beschauliche, brave Geschichten von beschaulichen, braven Kindern. Mit ihren Reihenfolgen wollen Deutschlehrer nur dafür sorgen, dass Leute wie wir unsere Geschichten für uns behalten. So in my translation, it's not as if the world provided us with an order or a sequence that makes sense. So why should I stick to one? Sequences are something for German teachers so that they can rein in our stories. What kind of stories are we supposed to create if we have to stick to introduction, main paragraph, conclusion all the time? Contemplative, well-behaved stories by contemplative, well-behaved children. With their sequences, German teachers only want to make sure that people like us keep our stories to ourselves. Drei Kameradinnen is one of those stories that broke white German literary criticism, in my opinion. Time and again, I saw commentators feel personally attacked because the main character spoke so openly about the reality of her and her friends' lives. One reader denounced the book as a literary failure on Swiss television. And when challenged on this, his thinly argued responses suggested to me that he'd completely misunderstood the book. Similarly, Olivia Wenzel's debut novel, Tausend Serpentinen Angst, or Thousand Coils of Fear in English, was harshly criticized for, and forgive me, I oversimplify a little, but not that much, not being nice enough to white German readers who care about the issues of social justice and want to be abgeholt or helped to understand. As if literature by non-white people only exists to raise awareness among white people. This, of course, is the logical consequence of what happens when the white perspective is deemed to be the universal perspective. There are isolated examples of German literary criticism which correctly identifies whiteness. I offer the following puzzle pieces. Inse Wilke's discussion of Nejati Öziri's short story, Morgen wach ich auf und dann beginnt das Leben, Tomorrow I'll wake up and then life will begin, at the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize competition last year. Pretty much any text by Mariam Aras, but especially her discussion of Schröder Lecture's Drei Kameradinnen und Olivia Wenzel's Tausend Serpentinen Angst. And Marit Ifeoma Kupka's discussion on the literary reception of Jackie Tome's Brüder. I've deliberately not included references to discussions on my novel. I honestly just didn't know how to do that elegantly, but perhaps we can discuss them on Friday evening. See what I did there? Plugging for my reading on Friday. So anyway, I'm gonna talk about the Literature Festival. So in her poem, Werke der Welten, which the author herself translates as pieces of the world, the spoken word artist, poet, social justice activist Furat Abdullah writes, wir schreiben bis zum letzten Atem, damit ein Hauch von Bewusstsein bleibt, ein Funke von Befreiung entfacht und im Innersten der Tatendrang erwacht, alles zu verändern. In English, we write until our last breath, so that a touch of consciousness remains, a spark of liberation inflames, and deep inside, the urge for action awakens to change everything. I'm just going to have a sip of water. Inspired by this poem, as well as the events, individuals, communities, and discussions, which I've already mentioned in this talk, if not to say frustrated by the lack of Black people working, being financially compensated for, and receiving recognition for their contributions to German language, literary imagination, I dreamt of curating a German language literature festival, one that is reminiscent of the competition for the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize, in that there is a jury which discusses the previously unpublished texts of invited authors. But the major difference is that there would not be a winner at the end. The aim would simply be to provide space for texts and their authors, quite beyond the limits of discussions around multiculturalism or political correctness. The discussions would circulate around issues of aesthetics, of themes, of imagery. There would be an exploration of continuities within Afro-diasporic literatures and disruptions. It would also provide an opportunity for networks to be established and expanded, for new and emerging authors to have a chance to meet with literary agents, literature critics, and publishers. Black German language fiction is not new. The first novel by Black German author Douala Misipo was written between 1930, so towards the end of the Weimar Republic, and 1960. Perhaps there were other novels before, who knows? Certainly Black German-speaking people have been writing creative fiction and have struggled to gain recognition outside of their own community contexts. When I was asked to give the opening talk at this year's Ruhrfestspiele Recklinghausen, I was asked if I would also like to contribute in some way to the curation of the 6-week festival. I mentioned my idea of the Black Literary Festival, and miraculously they agreed to a cooperation. Resonanzen, the name I chose for the festival, will take place from May 19th until May 21st. I chose the name Resonanzen because I like this word, resonance, and also because I felt like I wanted to think about how different people collectively write a body of work, and not to just focus on the achievements of one single person. I have included the images and names of just some of the people who are contributing to Resonanzen in this presentation. 6 people are missing, however. These are the authors. I've had the great honor to be able to invite 6 talented individuals to share a text which they have specifically written for the festival. Indeed, I gave them the task of thinking about the word Erbe, which is inheritance. And they've all written a text, and their names will be revealed on Thursday, May the 19th. I have one final thought that I'd like to share with you all. While I was planning my lecture, I had the idea of maybe structuring it around pieces of shrapnel. Those familiar with my first novella know that I use that image to describe the fallout that occurs after the explosive breakup of a marriage. Shrapnel would have perhaps also fitted well with the current war mood. And then I imagined writing this lecture in a series of tweets, like an epic tweet thread, if you will, or perhaps providing descriptions of my ideas in a collection of memes. I imagined everyone in the audience kind of scrolling up as they listened to me talk. But in the end, I decided to stick with the image of the puzzle. Although many people choose to work on puzzles alone, it is also possible to invite others to join you. It is generally an activity that, with very few exceptions, everyone can participate in without needing any prior knowledge or training. It's a collaborative effort. There is no winner. unless you're puzzling with a really annoying person, but that's a different story. And when you're finished, there's a big picture. And the process to get there can be long or can be short, but there is light at the end of a tunnel. In fact, the process is the point. Once you're done, you can happily look at the picture you've created, perhaps jointly with another person or perhaps despite that other person, but you can also break the puzzle apart and do the whole thing again, because the process is the point. Thank you very much. I don't sit down.
Yes, good. Thank you so much. I kind of don't know what to say because anything coming after that would just seem a bit trite, but it was amazing. Thank you. And it was complicated. And I wrote down what you said because I just love the way you said it, that there is no such thing as a simple answer to a complex problem, and anyone who tells you is lying. Thank you for saying that.
You're welcome.
We're going to have questions just for people in the hall. Don't ask a question until you're holding a microphone, because otherwise the people on Zoom won't hear what your question was. There will be a roving mic, so that won't be a problem. People on Zoom, actually probably still on the other side of you, because otherwise I won't see whether we have questions on Zoom. Are there any questions coming in yet? In that case, let's start with the Zoom question.
I'm going to read this out because it's a bit longer. Thank you so much for this inspiring talk and the slideshow for disrupting our ways of seeing and reading. You mentioned your undergraduate degree in German studies. What would you like undergraduate language education and schools language education to look like in the UK in the future?
Oh,
on you go.
What was that about the no easy? What would I like them to look like in the future? Well, I worked a lot in this presentation with images and working on how things look, but I did also mention that it's not only about how things look, it's also about the content, right? So I do think people are not going to be able to magically, I don't know, employ 50% of the German studies department as Black lecturers, I imagine, or 50% teachers are all Black all of a sudden. So what can we do then? What we can do is work with what we have. And I'm assuming that people who teach German literature, enjoy reading, enjoy good literature. And I would be really excited to find out if they would be willing and participate in an exercise of diversifying what they're reading, and then in the next step, what they're teaching. There's a really nice book that's just come out called, it's written by Nicole Seifert, and it's called Frauenliteratur, or women's literature, but the word Frauen is crossed out. And Nicole writes a lot about how she realized that as a German studies student herself, a lot of the work that she read was, I mean, actually all the work she read during her studies was written by men, and she thought about why this was, and she did some research and found out that actually throughout the period of time of the works that were being published that she was studying, there were women also writing, if we're only talking about this binary understanding of gender, of course. So there were women who were writing, but they just weren't, they didn't have the resonance as it was. And so she made it explicitly an aim to read those works that are not so well known. And she also translates works and she writes about them. And it was a conscious decision that she made to look at the books on her shelf, look at the writing, because literature is also about referring to other works of literature. Like as an author, my work works kind of like in a network with other works. And those networks don't even necessarily come together in my imagination. They happen in the heads of the readers. So it's really important, I think, for German teachers and German lecturers to recognize this, and it's kind of a human thing. We read what we like, we read what we are familiar with and what we know, but to look at what we're reading and saying, oh, maybe there's some gaps. How can I find out about those gaps and look for more?
Thank you very much. Do you have any questions in the room at the moment? Yes, sorry, I didn't see you.
Hi, thank you so much for that. I wanted to ask a bit about how you brought up, for example, how Black characters are often peripheral in stories, but how there is also the racialization of like how certain, for example, with Der Struwwelpeter, how there's idea of how certain features or how certain imagery is represented in German literature, which then can have a racial undertone. I was wondering if you had, if you could expand a bit on that. Possibly?
On that, oh, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. So let's stick with Struwwelpeter. Struwwelpeter is anyone who likes Struwwelpeter? I mean, I know, sorry, I shouldn't have said it like that. Let me take that back. Cut. Struwwelpeter is a book that I think has gone out of fashion. Is that fair to say? It is a book, a collection of short stories for children. And some of them are kind of scary, like the stories with a moral twist so that children learn how to behave well. One of the stories is about, I think, not sucking your thumb, otherwise someone will come and cut the thumb. And then there's really graphic images as well. Anyway, the story in Struwwelpeter that I was referring to, I think in English is called something about Inky Boys, I think. And the story is basically explaining to children that you shouldn't be horrible to people. You shouldn't call them names because otherwise you'll be punished. And so these children were making fun of a Black young boy, and Struwwelpeter or whatever, someone came along and said, oh, you shouldn't do that. And as a punishment, these white children were dropped in a vat of ink and they became Black. And that was the punishment, right? Well-intentioned, I think. The problem is, of course, that telling a child that if you make fun of Black people, you yourself will become Black doesn't really work if you're a Black child. You're like, oh, so I've been punished for what now? And it seems very banal, but the thing is, throughout my childhood and throughout my children's childhood, going to school in a predominantly white place was always about negotiating weird comments and conversations. One example that I've written about recently, my son was sitting in the classroom and somebody tried to use an eraser on his skin, and my child asked, why are you doing that? And then I said, well, you know, what is it? Black skin is the color of the devil. And the thing is, this wasn't a child who was trying to bully my son. This was a child who had just read things like Struwwelpeter, right? So this is what happens. And there's another, to move on from Struwwelpeter, but it's in the same tradition. I mentioned a play called Unschuld by Dia Loa. Unschuld means innocence. And Unschuld was a play that was put on stage, when was it, 2012, 2013, around that time. And on the staging of the play, the actors, two of the actors were wearing makeup. They were using blackface. And the whole point was these two actors were pretending to be, and I think the actual quote is illegale schwarze Immigrantinnen, which is illegal Black immigrants, right? And throughout the play, the makeup that they have on their face rubs off. The symbolism being, a little bit like Struwwelpeter, as their Black skin color rubs off, they become more and more human, right? And there was a big backlash. There were people who protested that. I mean, in any case, there's always been protests, but in 2012, 2013, social media allowed people to be very visible about how they were doing that. But, you know, before, what would we do? We'd write to newspapers. The newspaper may or may not print up our reader's letter. But 2013, you could write on the wall of Deutsches Theater and all of the comments were visible. So the whole thing became a big mess. And it was really hard for the actors and the playwright and the directors because they hadn't thought through those questions and ideas before. So I would say promoting Black literature isn't only about the well-being of Black people, it's also about rescuing people from ignorance. And it's better for everybody to have more diverse literature. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Thank you. Any more in the room? We've got one coming in on Zoom. Yeah.
Yes, there's a question from Andrew, and he asks, I liked the line from your song, I've been walking for 14 years. It makes me think about walking as an experience, maybe in relation to the last part of Ada's Raum. Could you say something more about this?
Wait, the last part of Ada's Raum and walking?
Yes, the line of the song, I've been walking for 14 years, makes me think about walking as an experience, maybe in relation to the last part of Ada's Raum.
Oh, I have to be really creative now. I need to get some overtime payments. I'm kidding. So walking, no, I'll try. Walking as an experience. So yeah, obviously when I wrote the song, I was 14, and I was trying to express this feeling of never having found a place of rest and never having the feeling that I could really just sit down and think, okay, I feel good here. And in my novel, we have a character called Ada, which can also be pronounced as Ada or Ada. And this character, who is in 2019 in Berlin, is a young woman from Ghana. She was born in London, but lived in Ghana for her formative years and moves to Berlin to live with her half-sister. And we meet her, she's pregnant, she's she's about to become a single parent, and she's looking for a place to live. So this feeling of walking does kind of fit with that sensation that this character has of looking. She's looking for a place to live. It's really hard. In the novel, you see various situations where she's confronted with prejudice of other people. But the other thing about this figure is she lives in 2019, but the way the story is told, there are repetitions of images, of words, storylines, or constellations of friendships, characters, where the reader understands at the end of the novel that this is a figure that perhaps has lived before, or has continuities in any case with people who have lived in the 15th century in West Africa, in the 19th century in England, and in 1945 in Germany. So there's a very specific context of walking and walking and walking, looking for a place to be, looking for a Raum, actually. And then there's a kind of much bigger context of history. Doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it has, someone said it rhymes, like it has echoes, and this keeps going. And the idea being that we need to be able to look at what's happened in the past and to examine trauma and integrate it somehow into our present day before we can really find a place to rest. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got a question in the room. Oh, 2 questions in the room.
Thanks, Sarah. And thank you so much for that really inspiring presentation. What you were just saying then just chimed with what you were saying earlier about linearity.
Yeah.
And you know, getting away from linearity and order. And I just wondered how that seemed to you as a writer when you're writing. So, you know, it's fascinating to hear you talking about that in terms of the novel. But what about in your imagination when you're trying to sort of think about how you know, make those connections?
Thank you for the question. I struggle with linearity. You might have noticed that. So often when I'm writing an essay, I try to stick, because I think an essay is much more about having a point, a question, if you will, and then you go through different steps and you're bringing people along with you. You're trying to persuade them of your argument so that at the end, when you get to the end, everyone goes, ah, I see, right? But the more I write, the less patient I am with that premise, because I don't think that way, actually. I have an idea. Oh, who doesn't know this? You're sitting at the desk, you're writing something, and then you think, oh, I need to go and get a pen. No, you don't need a pen, you're writing. Hang on. I need to go and get something to drink. You get up, you walk off, and then as you're walking down, you forget what it was you wanted. And you're like wandering around thinking, well, what? And then you have to go back and sit down and realize, it was a glass of water. And I think our brains work that way, that we make different associations with different things. We don't, I don't think we lead linear lives, actually. So I was more interested in trying to capture that feeling of just being all over the place. And what could that feel like to read? I think I realized with my novel that a lot of people like to just read a book that does have a linear, because it's like a place where you can rest, you can just open a book, relax, and then be carried away for a while. It's like watching a film or a series, I suppose, where you just like switch off and just be carried away by the plot. But I wanted to write something where the reader had to actively participate in making the story. Or I think readers do participate in making stories, and I really made it very explicit. So what was the question again? See, I just displayed exactly what I was talking about. Anyway, that's how it is for me, yeah. So I think it can be hard work to read my work, but I think also what I do is I build in a reward at the end. So you do get to the end and you think, I figured that out, and that feels good.
Brilliant, thank you. There's another question in the back row.
Hi, thank you. I just had a question with regards to that you can sort of navigate both the English and the German literary worlds, and like sort of the opportunities and challenges that might present to you. So I was wondering whether you felt that either language lends itself differently to writing and thinking about Blackness, or your particular experience of Blackness, and does the way that you write or think about Blackness change depending on which language you're using?
That's a great question. I should have prepared an answer for that. Okay, what was the first part of the question again?
Just whether you find that thinking and writing about Blackness changes, or that there are opportunities or challenges to using a particular one to think and write about Blackness.
Changes. Okay, so definitely it's different. This I can tell you for free. One thing that's different, which has not anything specifically to do with Blackness, but it is part of the story, is German is a very gendered language. Everything has a der or a die or a das, right? And I feel a lot freer in English to, I know when I wrote Synchronicity, for example, I remember writing Synchronicity and it was specifically about gender, that story. And I would write something like the taxi driver, something. And it was much later on the page, or maybe on the next page, that then we found out whether the taxi driver was male or female. In that case. And in the German translation, the decision had to be made really with the word taxi driver. And that's kind of annoying. I did not like that. So it's a challenge to write, for me to write creatively in German for that reason. And then currently, this is kind of a bit controversial in Germany. There's currently discussions around the language. So Black people and people of color who are using the German language to discuss these things often use English terms. So for example, the term people of color is used in German. Or at the moment, in recent years, these debates around colorism have become really prominent, which I think is a good development. So colorism is really an inner Black community discussion, which focuses on the fact that traditionally, there's been a tradition of lighter skinned Black people being deemed as more attractive, more intelligent than darker skinned Black people. And this is something that's very difficult to discuss in German because the vocabulary doesn't exist. You can't. So when people talk about light skinned and dark skinned people in German, they use the English words, because if you think about it, if you say hellhäutig und dunkelhäutig, that actually just means white and black, right? So it's frustrating, and people are not happy about it, but it highlights a gap which has come from the lack of institutionalized Black German knowledge. There's no institution of Black studies in Germany, although there are many people doing brilliant work, but they're not getting the recognition that should be afforded to them. Have I answered the question, or I've forgotten something? Have I forgotten something? No? Oh, okay, good. All right. I did a good job. Thank you. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you. How are we doing on Zoom questions?
Tiffany is asking.
Tiffany.
That's what she thanks you a lot. And then she asks about the Black Literary Festival that you're organizing and whether you have any more information to share with us and whether there's any information available online.
Oh, yes, there is. Okay, I should have said that. The festival is online, but it's a long URL. I don't know how to do that. You'd have to Google Ruhrfestspielen Recklinghausen, and then they have the program. And if you click on literature, then you'll see eventually the page for Resonanzen. And at the moment, the page contains information about the festival, just a short description, and it contains a rough program of what's going to be happening over the 3 days, so May 19th, May 20th, and May 21st, and tickets you can buy. This is a difficult part. So at the moment, you can only visit the festival in person. But we are in negotiation, because I would very much like it to be possible for people to watch the festival online, and that's a technical discussion and so on and so forth, a strategy about when the recordings would then be put online. But I encourage everybody who's watching this talk to write to the Ruhrfestspielen and say, we want to see the festival. The more people who write, the better.
That's 300 emails.
Do your thing.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tara. Whichever order they came in, I didn't see it happen. Go for it.
Hi. You spoke at the beginning, we were talking about double consciousness.
Yes.
By Dubois, and reaching a state of truer self through the combination of the American and the Negro. So I was wondering, do you think we are nearing a truer self as a Black race spiritually? And if not, what steps must we take?
I'm just thinking. I have a complicated answer. I don't see a linearity, actually, where one was not that good and we're now nearly there and it's all going to be great. I don't see that, at least not yet.
No, me neither.
We're on the same page. I see something more like, actually, my novel is structured in the infinity sign. A kind of a loop. It's not just a loop that we're going round and round, not getting anywhere. It is a development. But what I see is the challenges that we faced as Black people are very real, and we can still learn from people who've lived before us. We can learn from our ancestors, right? So when I imagine, what I imagine when I'm feeling really depressed is racism. Here still, and will be here for many years, probably centuries, right? What am I doing? Why am I even trying? And then I think, okay, centuries before me, people were enslaved and somehow still managed to hold on to their humanity and still managed to keep hold of the languages that they brought with them from Africa, the stories, the songs, the dances, the recipes. They kept hold of all of that and passed it to their children and grandchildren in an effort to stay alive, right? Not just to exist, but to actually to keep hold of the culture and still be people, still be human. And how did they keep hold of that? Although they'd been so violently removed from everything they'd ever known and knew they would never go back, how did they keep hold of this vision that they still wanted to stay alive? And when I think about that, and I think, okay, I can learn from that and do something similar with my work. That's what keeps me going. And I can't really answer the question very well. It's not about saying, okay, we're all heading in this direction, it's going to be great. It's like, let's keep transforming. I don't believe in the happy end, I guess. I don't believe in the happy end. I think that this is a state that we're in, which is we're working with this attack on our humanity, and we're transforming it, and we're supporting each other to keep doing that. And that's what I'm doing. That's what I encourage everybody to do. Oh, that sounds a bit depressing, I think.
No,
but,
I think it's a hard topic.
Yeah, but that's my answer. Yeah.
Thank you.
I've been thinking through your complexities from my own perspective. I work in education, and the teaching of German in British schools is in a downward spiral that
Yes.
we are trying to do something about with great support from Professor Coleman. It did seem to me as if your move to German and Germany might have provided you with the base that you were looking for in your song. And that I'm just wondering, first of all, what opportunities you had to learn the initial stages of German in school, and how you would encourage, if you would encourage, I imagine you probably would, young Black people to learn German, because even though within this downward spiral that I'm talking about, which is generally accepted, there are even fewer opportunities for young Black students to learn German.
Yeah, this is true. This is tragic. And did I mention Brexit already? I'm so upset about Brexit. I turned my back for 5 minutes. Yeah, no, it's true. And I studied German actually in Royal Holloway, University of London. Yeah. And when I studied, there was a German department, and I know there isn't anymore. It's now, what is it, Modern Languages and Literatures or something. And I'm really, really sad about it. And I'm very sad about the fact that it's really hard now, if not impossible. I don't know, for people learning German to just go to Germany and just live there and work there and travel there. Like, I don't know how that works anymore. When I was a student, it was EU. We just hopped over, on the plane. How is it now?
Well, it's not just Brexit. We've had a large number of scandals in this country over child abuse and so murders, which have made it very, very difficult for school teachers to organize exchanges to Germany.
Okay, I didn't know about that.
And I completely agree with what you're saying. But there is the additional, yet more complications.
Yeah. No, yes, but the question was encouraging people to learn German. So I'll try for that. I was anyway a person who loved, I was one of those people who enjoyed learning. I enjoyed school. I particularly enjoyed learning languages, and I liked art, I liked theater. So I came to German also with this interest in theater, like I talked about Dürrenmatt. I also liked Bertolt Brecht, Max Frisch, and so on. And although I found it impossible with this der, die, das, and the Fälle, accusative, dative, why? Anyway, I stuck with it. It's like a love-hate relationship I had with German, right? And what I found when I went to Germany was I really enjoyed, what I found was a genuine willingness to roll up the sleeves and engage. This is what, it's very simplified and not true for everybody and so on and so forth. But I remember growing up in the UK that I found in general, everything was very polite and people didn't want to touch on controversial subjects. We just agree to disagree and step back. And in Germany, they're like, what did you say? And you had to defend what you said and then bring more arguments and proof. And that was scary at some point, but then I really enjoyed it. I felt like I was really intellectually challenged, especially in Berlin, And then the other thing that happened to me when I was in Germany was I met many Black Germans, and I realized I learned in Germany a lot about politics, Black politics and the diaspora. And I found out, for example, that people like W.E.B. Du Bois studied in Berlin. Angela Davis was a big hero for many East Germans, and visits Germany often. And there was a kind of a hub of knowledge and activity that really, finding the literature of Maya Yim, and where she was expressing things in her writing that I was anyway feeling and thinking, wow, that happens in German. Because when I was learning German, of course, all the school books were like Klaus and Liesel, and, and I didn't think Black people existed in Germany at all. I thought I'd be the first one. like an explorer. Anyway, so when I met these people, these communities, it was really exciting for me, and I learned a lot, also in terms of like social justice. And so I would definitely encourage young Black people to learn German for the specific reason of learning more about these different issues as well, like the history of anti-racist movements in Germany and how US Americans and Germans really work together on a lot of things. This is stuff that's hasn't been, I mean, I didn't learn it in school or during my studies, but it was mind-blowing when I then went to Berlin and learned all about it. Yeah, and I don't know, I just feel really sad that it's gone in that direction. Yeah.
I think you might be in a position to help with that.
Okay, I'll do my best.
Given that you're not busy.
No.
Thank you. I'm aware we've been making you take a lot of questions, maybe 1, 2 more
I'm
maximum.
good, yeah.
And then we'll draw it to a close. Is there one in the room? Go for it. And then we'll maybe do a last one online as well.
Thank you. I'll play up to the cliche of the blunt German and ask you a really direct question about racism, or actually 2 questions about racism.
I think you said the blonde German.
I can also do that, not graying blonde. The first one has to do with writing in German, the experience of writing in German. James Joyce said somewhere that whenever he wrote in English, he had to remind himself that he was writing in the language of the colonizer. And I wonder if this is ever something that crosses your mind, that this is actually a language, German, of colonial oppression, and how German, this is coming back to the question asked just a few minutes ago, in this respect, at least, the language of oppression and colonization compares to English, for you personally, perhaps also more generally. And the second question has to do with the first loop that you showed us. I know I wasn't supposed to feel that way, but I was actually quite impressed that there were so many women on the German jury and publishing teams. I thought, wow, they are making progress. And this question has to do with how much hope is there actually for a more racially diverse and egalitarian German society. I guess the question is really, to some extent, are you an Afro-pessimist? How deep does racism go in Germany? The Germans themselves, myself included, would like to think that they've made enormous strides in terms of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the Holocaust, dealing with racism in that regard, much more so than Austria, say, or Japan. Japan's dealing with its own, wartime legacies. Is this something? Is this German dealing with Black-white racism or anti-Black racism? Is there hope, perhaps, in the light of those strides made in dealing with the Holocaust? Or are these actually 2 clashing movements? Right? It's a big debate right now, going back to what Dirk Moses and Jürgen Zimmer have said about decolonizing Auschwitz. I'm sure you followed that debate. A former director of the Ruhrfestspiele, of course, Ashley Mbemba, has also been caught up in that debate. Exactly. So is there hope? And then maybe finally, and I'm sorry, I know I'm really over.
3 questions.
Overburdening a little bit. He's getting his money's worth.
I really want to, but it's really important because so many of the images you're showing us here, Get Out There, for instance, or Malcolm X, have to do with the American experience of racism. And I just wonder if both at the theoretical front, how we approach German racism, can we apply those American paradigms to Germany? Critical race theory, I mentioned Afro-pessimism just a little bit ago. Or is the Black experience in Germany so different because of the absence of slavery, for instance, or the different experience of slavery, that the 2 are not actually compatible? It seemed to me like you actually assumed they were compatible and that German racism should be looked at through the lens of these American paradigms. You mentioned Toni Morrison, Du Bois, and so on and so on. So just to repeat, because this was very nonlinear, I'm sorry. Language of the colonizer.
Language.
Is there hope, or are you an Afro-pessimist? And third, are these American theoretical paradigms applicable to Germany?
So My next talk, okay, I'll do my best. Language of the colonizer, language. Yeah, it has crossed my mind, both with writing in English and writing in German. In any case, language is kind of a very painful situation because I was raised to Ghanaian parents who were raising their children in London and were told and believed to themselves at the time that they should speak to their children in English because that's the only way to ensure that they'll do well in school, get a good education, get a good job, be successful, etc. And I really regret that I didn't retain the language that my parents speak as their first language, which is Ga. And it's a similar thing that's told to families who live in Germany and they speak a different language other than German at home. They're told they shouldn't do that. Although there is an exception. If you speak English or French, you're good. Spanish, I guess, is also okay. But Turkish, Arabic, not so much, right? So language is a thing. I feel very, very sad that in the end, to date, I still didn't manage to learn the language that my parents speak as their first language. It meant, for example, that when my grandparents were alive, I didn't converse with them. We would sit and look at each other and smile. That would be it. And maybe someone might translate a greeting, but that more didn't happen. And that was a real break in continuity in communication. So what I decided to do was to use this language, or both of them, and work with them to insert, because language is not only the vocabulary, it's also what it carries, right? Poetry creates gaps, and in those gaps, there's room for interpretation, and people bring then themselves into those gaps and fill it. And I decided to use those language and fill the gaps with more than what it has been used for. I mean, it's not only me and all that, but, and what I did with Ada's Raum is I deliberately worked with different languages. I don't even speak, I wrote Polish in the novel and I don't speak Polish, right? But what I wanted to do was to show that this kind of very clean break between one language and the next is not really true in real life. Many people are multilingual, but even if they speak one language, even within that one language, they use different registers. They would speak to the Queen differently than how they speak to the bus driver or so on. And for me, this is all part of how you can use language creatively and expand it to meet your needs. So in Ada's Raum, I made an effort to insert different languages, but I also I coined vocabulary. So for example, kissing your teeth is a thing that can be done in English, right? Right, I can't do it because I haven't got enough water. Wait a minute, okay. Something like that. In German, there isn't a word for that. And in Ada's Raum, I just wrote, sie küsst ihre Zähne, she kisses her teeth. I just wrote it literally because I imagined, first of all, if people don't know what it is, they might try to do it themselves. And if you do it, then you kind of get the sound, right? And then I thought, I want people to have access to this thing. It's a cultural thing that many Black people do, which I can't do right now because I've been talking so much, but that people reading this book, Black people reading the book would be like, oh yeah, it's not just a character that happens to look Black, but she has also the cultural attributes. And white people who don't know it perhaps will ask their friend or maybe Google it or what have you, and then it will become part of German language. That's what I did. I'm trying to hack the German language, that's right. So number 2 was,
How deep is German racism?
Afro-pessimism. I don't know so much about Afro-pessimism. I have to admit, I have to do my homework on that. But your question is, it's not an easy question for me to just answer quickly, I would say. Because I hear an assumption of what racism is that I don't share. I think we would have to get into a conversation, but I don't think about racism in terms of, I'm often asked, do I think England is more racist than Germany or vice versa? And my answer is I wouldn't rank it. I don't, It's not something that I conceive of in that way. It's more like how it manifests in each cultural context, what happens there. And I experience racism in all contexts, and none of it is good. You know, I don't really have a more favorite racism or something. So what I would say, maybe this is an attempt. What I would say is this: I would like to reclaim, in a way, the word racism, not as something that is very, very bad and evil and people are going to die, but to say it's an objective description of what we are experiencing. It's just an objective description of what goes on. And when we think about it in those terms and then say, okay, so it does exist and these are the ways it does exist, how can we then, the more that we're able to name it and recognize it, the better it quicker, easier, what have you, will be to then tackle them in those specific manifestations. One thing that's happened recently is a community initiative have, over a period of years, 2 years or so, carried out a survey called Afro Census of Black people living in Germany. And they asked many, they tried to reach, I think they reached 7,000 Black people, and asked them a whole range of questions about their experience of living in Germany. And this report has now come out, and it's a very comprehensive report which paints a really vivid picture of life in Germany as a Black person. It has stats and everything, pie charts and such. I'm not a mathematician, but they did a good job. And what happens with this is now, in the past, it hasn't been possible to talk about racism in Germany with some kind of weight, because we didn't have stats. We don't do ethnic monitoring in Germany in the same way you do in the UK. So in the UK, you can say, oh, percentage of Black people going to university is not as high as it should be or such. You can't do that really in Germany. But what they did with the Afro Census was they got other stats, other figures, and put that together into a report. And now we have a body of work which shows the structural issues that are there for Black people living in Germany. And we can take that and work on it. And then it's not so relevant what's happening in Austria and everywhere else, because we've got work to do here. That's how I would answer that question. The third one.
I think we probably need to wind up.
Oh, okay.
But thank you so much. And I'm so sorry to the people who are attending on Zoom that we don't have any more time for questions, but it does feel like it's time we gave Sharon the rest.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your energy, and thank you for your thoughtfulness, and thank you for your ability to articulate things that are incredibly complicated. I think everyone in this room and everyone on Zoom shares that feeling of gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And there are drinks in the foyer for anybody who'd like to join us for one afterwards. Sorry to people on Zoom, that's not an option for you. Thank you very much for coming.
I forgot the last question, but you remember. Yeah.